All right, and I'm going to pass it off to Chloe.
Okay, so before we dive into the key findings, I'm going to give a little bit of background of how this analysis fits into the city plan and other things and other efforts cities undertaking to address flooding. So some of you, if you've been following along with the city plan for a while, this will be repeat information. I'll try and go through it quickly. So in this city plan survey, we got this just reaffirmed what I think we all know, that flooding is a growing problem. It's been a problem and it's getting worse in the city. So we saw this reflected in the data in terms of what we heard from folks that 20% home or property has been damaged by flooding in the past. This was higher among youth tenants and lower income respondents. 78% of respondents are concerned somewhat or very about their home or property being impacted by flooding in the future. So that's a lot. And so we know that this is a top concern for residents, it's a top concern for staff, and that's really why we put water first. So everything, we wanted to have this analysis be the basis for all of the recommendations in the plan. This has been a guiding principle for the plan from the start. We're also building off of the Dutch Dialogues Charleston report. If you're not familiar with Jim, we'll drop that link in the chat and you can learn more about that. The Dutch Dialogues focused on there were 4 focus areas in the city where it went much more into depth than this analysis did. What we wanted to do was take the principles from the Dutch Dialogues report and some of the key lessons from that and apply it on a citywide level. So the plan area that this analysis is looking at is all of the city, including the Kenoi area, West Ashley, Johns Island, James Island, and downtown Peninsula. This is a snapshot from the executive summary in the land and water analysis, just showing how all these different layers fit together. So the city plan will guide development and planning decisions, specifically land use. And so you'll see the way that they have this falls under habitation, development, and land use. This is what some of the recommendations will be focused on in terms of codes and regulations that may apply to development and land use. The infrastructure investments we make in infrastructure, how we move around the city, transportation networks, drainage infrastructure. That's not the planning department's focus, but we can write recommendations in terms of priority investments where we prioritize investments for future infrastructure projects based on where we are growing and areas that we know need the most help. But what we were missing was this base layer here, this baseline of what do we know and understand about our soil, water, and ecology, and how does that influence all of these things above it. So that is really what this analysis focuses on, and incorporating understanding of water and flooding and sea level rise in a way that has never been done in a previous land use plan for the city of Charleston. And this is going to complement, we're hoping that this will complement all of these other efforts. So this is not happening in a vacuum. This plan, the city has a flooding and sea level rise strategy. Again, the Dutch Dialogues Charleston report, which I already mentioned, recent updates to the stormwater design standards manual, which is very technical, and that gets into what requirements developers have to follow in order to meet certain stormwater management criteria. And so that's separate from the city plan as well, but it definitely is something that we need in place to complement any land use recommendations we make. The city's also done an all hazards vulnerability and risk assessment, looking at areas at highest risk for different disasters. So flooding and hurricane related disasters being part of that. It also looks at other disasters not related to water and flooding. And then the Peninsula Flood Risk Management Study that the Army Corps of Engineers is working on, and that we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So there's a lot going on, and this plan we hope, we intend to make sure that this plan aligns with and it is complementary to all of these other efforts. Take a pause for any clarification questions just from what I presented just now.
Also want to note that Jim has dropped some links in the chat for you to reference regarding the Dutch dialogues in that report, and then the sea level rise strategy report as well. Or strategy, I should say. Does anyone have at least one question they'd like to ask? You know, it's always nice to hear at least if there's one question. No questions. All right. All right, Chloe.
Everyone's excited about the findings. So I will preface this by saying that the land and water analysis report is 294 pages long, and it's highly technical. And we have a full hour and a half for this meeting, and we really want to make sure that we get into presenting the draft recommendations that respond to this analysis and getting folks' feedback on those recommendations. So what you're going to hear and see in the next few minutes is a very pared down version of the analysis. We're focusing on those key findings. You know, with educational, with a goal on education. So we're sort of all singing from the same sheet of music in terms of what we understood from the report and how that will apply to the city plan. If you want the more technical, in-depth deep dive, there are presentations that we can send in the follow-up email that you can watch online, and then the link to the 294 page report is on the city plan website. So if that's what you're interested in, we have all that available, but that is not what we're going to do tonight. Okay. So first, it's important to understand that there's multiple types of flooding that Charleston has to deal with. And again, in the report, it breaks it down to even more nuanced level than this, but for the purposes, again, of just simplicity, the tides, these are things that the rising and fall of the tides, it happens every single day. We can depend on that to happen every single day, depending on the moon cycle. Those tides may be higher. It can cause flooding in low-lying areas. Those tides are getting higher and higher. We'll see that change with sea level rise. And so this is really going to influence our strategies in terms of where and how much development should occur, especially thinking about those low-lying areas that are at highest risk for tidal flooding. And then rainfall. So any flooding associated with water falling from the sky, whether that's the associated runoff with that or rain bombs, this is going to influence more so the design of buildings and infrastructure, how we capture that that water and move it efficiently and effectively to avoid flooding. And then storm surge related to hurricanes. That is a more rare occurrence, but can be highly destructive. And so that is going to influence which adaptation and defense strategies we adopt to protect and move as much homes and property out of harm's way as we can in the case of severe disasters. Then there are some areas of the city that can experience all three of these at the same time, and specifically tidal rainfall runoff is compound flooding. And so that we'll get to that later in the results of the areas that are in that zone of experiencing compound flooding problems. When we talk about sea level rise, I want to be specific about which timeline and which predictions we're working with. So we are basing our sea level rise predictions on the NOAA data. which is different from the Army Corps of Engineers if you've been following that process with the storm surge barrier for the peninsula. This is based on a 50-year timeline, 2020, 2070. We're following the intermediate, which is the same, the intermediate level, which is the same as our sea level rise strategy, just to give a sense of what that means, what does this mean in terms of what to expect. So right now, the 7 feet tide is the threshold for tidal flooding in the lowest lying areas of the city. By this prediction, we could expect to have that be the average daily high tide by 2040. And again, these are just predictions. It's like a hurricane, you never know where it's going to go. So this is a highly dynamic situation, but this is the model that we are working with to inform this analysis. So it gets even more complicated. So there's various types of flooding, dynamic situation with sea level rise, and then we also have more things than just elevation playing together to influence how severe flooding is and who is impacted the most. So there are different watershed types throughout the city, or drainage basins. 94 citywide, 197 sub-watersheds. All of them are different and unique in how they handle water. So it gets complicated very quickly when you start to look at the sort of hyper-local scenarios for flooding. And these watershed types influence how fast, how far water needs to travel to be able to drain out, and how much interaction there is with the tides. And the soils and vegetation of the landscape. So if it's a more urban landscape, maybe with more pavement, it's going to be harder for that landscape to absorb water. In some of our higher areas, they may not deal with tidal flooding, but they may have good soils for absorbing water. So there's that adds another level of nuance. And our infrastructure, of course, is very important in terms of the capacity and the efficiency of our drainage systems, and also protective structures. So like the battery wall, for example, that is also impacts an area's ability to be resilient to flooding. And then vulnerability is another layer in this. And this, the data used in the analysis was taken from the all hazards and risk vulnerability assessment that I mentioned previously. This is looking at how many buildings and structures are currently in harm's way based on whether they're elevated, the structure itself is elevated, and where they are they up to code with recent elevation standards, et cetera. So looking at all of these things in terms of how an area may experience flooding now and in the future. This map, there are many maps, and as you've seen, many different layers to the analysis, but the one that is most relevant to the land use strategies and the land use recommendations that you'll see in the city plan is the elevation risk zone map. And that breaks the city into high ground, DAP zone, compound flood risk zone, tidal flood risk zone. The high ground, this is the area where there's the lowest flood risk, and the stormwater detention here has the greatest watershed benefit. In other words, the biggest responsibility to water management and capturing water. The adapt zone is where rain and storm surge flooding, and this is infrequent but not impossible. Compound flood risk zone, which I mentioned earlier, is a mixture of all the different types of flooding. And then the tidal flood risk zone is where flooding is frequent, and it can happen just from high tide, doesn't have to be raining. And this is also where we will see marsh migration with sea level rise, which we'll say more about what that means later. there's a big asterisk, a big caveat to this map. You'll see that a lot of the peninsula falls in the tidal flood risk zone and the adapt zone. So the peninsula is unique because it already has barrier protections and future barrier protections are under study. So the approach to any elevation-based land use recommendations for the peninsula need to be tailored because of that very unique situation that the rest of the city does not have. And again, mentioning the current study by the Army Corps of Engineers looking at a future barrier protection approach to the peninsula area. So quickly go back to looking at these 4 zones: high ground, adapt, compound flood, and tidal flood risk. With sea level rise, we can expect the threshold for these to shift upwards. And marsh migration, this is this diagonal lines here, it shows where the marsh migration zone is, and that's all within the tidal flood risk zone. This is showing what we can expect from marsh migration. So it sounds like, it is what it sounds like. It's when the marsh will gradually shift inland, will move inland to what was previously dry land. And this will happen as a result of sea level rise. So if we apply reserve strategies, which we'll talk about in a second, it will give the marsh room to migrate. Whereas if we use defend strategies like seawalls, then it can cut that marsh off from being able to move inland. And essentially the marsh will then die. So when we're looking at beyond land use categories, which we'll talk about in the recommendations, basically a combination of planning strategies need to be applied in all land use categories. So you can see reserve happens both on high ground and also in the tidal flood risk zone. Reserve is restoring and preserving natural ecosystems. Adapt, retrofitting vulnerable existing infrastructure to be resilient to water risks. Grow, this is a strategy where we can responsibly increase development of population. And again, growth must occur in tandem with water management. So those high ground areas have the most responsibility. And then defend, again, like seawalls, protective structures to protect buildings and infrastructure with engineered measures such as berms, flood walls, and pumps. So all of these different strategies, you won't see these strategies necessarily in the land use categories. You will see them in other policy tools that will supplement the city plan. So, and these will all be determined by watershed type, soils and vegetation, infrastructure, and vulnerability, those beyond elevation categories I mentioned earlier. Those will be implemented through things like zoning, stormwater regulations, and then other tools as well. Take a pause here for any questions.
There actually is a question that was sent to me directly, Chloe, and the question is that maybe this is in the detail, but how many people in Charleston participated in the survey? 70% of how many?
Oh, over 2,500. Thank you. Over 2,500 people participated in the city plan survey.
Okay. The person that sent me that question, if that's not clear, let me know and I'll be more than happy to ask you additionally. Jim also put in the chat the city plan water analysis blog. So if anyone wants to read additionally into that, a lot of this information was shared out in different phases just so it could be processed, because as Chloe said, I think you said it was 200 something pages. Is that right, Chloe? So it's a lot of information to swallow. So are there any questions that anybody has? You can either drop it in the chat or you can come off mute to ask before we move forward. Nobody has any questions. Flooding impacts so many of us in so many different ways.
Maybe I missed it, but this document in particular, this PowerPoint, is it available somewhere? Are you going to share it after the meeting? It's the pared down version of the longer 200-page plus document, right? The Reader's Digest version.
Exactly. This is the Reader's Digest version. And we've taken some liberties in sort of the graphic representation of the data and how we're communicating it, just to make it simpler to understand, because the original report is highly technical and quite overwhelming. It took staff probably sat in like 10 presentations looking at the same information over and over again, and it's still a lot to wrap our heads around. So yes, this is a Reader's Digest version.
I think this might be helpful to have, at least to the people that are here in the meeting, to share with our contacts throughout the neighborhood, because it is the condensed version. I've clicked on a couple of the links that are shared in the chat, and even those are pretty dense for kind of spreading the word. But if we have gone through this with you and understand the Reader's Digest version and have the graphics that you're sharing with us, we might be in a better position to share it with other people.
All right, we have another question. The Dutch Dialogues recommended the city create a full quote unquote water plan. Will this encompass that plan?
No, this will not encompass, this is not a full city water plan. I would like to, I don't know what all is included in a water plan, but I know that it is a very, very much more in-depth look at all that this analysis provided, but also all the infrastructure considerations. It would be a much more of an engineering level plan. Christopher, am I getting that right?
You are, Chloe. Yeah, it's much more involved, and we had a state mandate to get our comprehensive plan updated. So essentially what we did was, work to have Waggonner and Ball, of course, from the Dutch Dialogues and some of their associated consultants help us with a land and water analysis for the comp plan. But this is not a whole water study of the city, but it has some pretty good data about where water is going to be.
All right, thank you, Christopher. Another question is, did the analysis compare the impact of water to future housing construction?
This is from Gianna, impact of water to future housing construction. I want to make sure that I'm understanding the question correctly. So there are land use considerations in terms of where we want to encourage development in the future in terms of future housing construction and where we don't, based on this analysis. But in terms of doing an overlap with this and the housing analysis, we have not done that yet, but we can with the data that we have available. So Gianna, I don't know if you can, if that answered your question or if you could clarify further.
You answered it, Chloe. Thank you.
All right, awesome. Okay. And Chloe, you're getting kudos from Dale that you did a great job condensing this to try to, this is very
I saw that and I'm
material.
like, phew, because I was very worried.
Yeah, and I will say, as Lainey said, it still is, even though it still is above some of our heads as far as for processing it, because it's not everyday language that we're using. So, I think maybe making your own notes or something on the side, or even asking along the way. So that's what the questions and thoughts are for. So if you find that this is way too technical, it's still over my head, that's something we will note, because it's something that, the planning department working, with the team that created this, they can definitely look at how can we create maybe infographics or something that can maybe make this a little bit more understandable, because at the end of the day, we don't want it to just be the city and the, to be able to understand this. We want everyday individuals to be able to understand this and give feedback back, or we're just all here for nothing. So thank you for that feedback, Lainey. We appreciate that. Okay.
Are we ready?
And I think so. And I just want to note, it is okay to say, I have no idea what the heck Chloe just went over. So honestly, if you feel that way, you can secretly send it to me in the chat. I am totally fine with that. And I will share, and I'm sure that the team will appreciate that, because again, this lets all of us know we still need to break this down a little bit more. So just want to share that. And yes, we are ready.
Okay. Oops. Okay.
All right. So Chloe's going to go on to select draft recommendations.
Yeah, so the way that we're gonna, these are the selection of draft recommendations in the city plan, and I emphasize selection because both of these, we're gonna focus on the land use element and the natural resources element in the city plan. Those are the elements that are most relevant to the analysis that we just went over. But each of those elements are bigger. There's a longer list of recommendations that we're not going to focus on tonight, because we wanted to specifically focus on how the city plan now is responding to what we learned from the land and water analysis, and getting your feedback on those recommendations specifically. So if there's something that you expected to see that you're not seeing in there for the land use section, let us know. It is probably going to be shared in upcoming feedback sessions. So just wanted to start letting you all know that for expectations. Then also the way that I'm going to present this is I'm going to start with what we heard from the community. Those slides will be orange, marked in orange, and then the draft recommendations that staff have written for your feedback, those slides are in blue. Okay, so first in the city plan survey, again, this is the survey where over 2,500 people participated in the fall. We shared some of the recommendations from the Dutch Dialogue study to see what level of support there was for some of these different strategies. So they were create a public organization to manage stormwater and flood prevention projects between the different jurisdictions, reduce fill, adding new soil in low-lying marsh and other areas impacted by tides, design parks and green space to store water and reduce runoff, improve and maintain drainage infrastructure, strengthen building code and stormwater management requirements for new development, require new developments to better use the natural landscape to manage flooding and stormwater, and prioritize areas of the city at higher elevation for higher density development. So we saw pretty strong support for all of these strategies, with the exception of the one at the end, prioritize areas of the city at higher elevation for higher density development, given other constraints for the area. So things that we heard from the community during the first round of engagement that pertains specifically to land use. So community residents want to restrict development in low-lying areas, protect existing marsh, wetland, and coastal forests, specifically protecting what's called pre-development hydrology, or basically how the land is managing water naturally prior to development. So prioritizing that and reducing fill and build as much as is feasible. Incentivizing more green infrastructure throughout the city and in new development, making sure that any kind of heightened regulations related to resiliency and flood protections do not add an additional cost burden to lower income families in the city. Making it easier for homes to elevate, especially in the historic district, and updating, so this is a big one, updating the zoning ordinance to be based on elevation and flood risk. So basically updating the zoning ordinance to catch up with what the land use categories that are currently based on elevation. So I'm going to let Philip present the draft recommendations for our land use section. He's been working most closely with them.
Thank you, Chloe. Just wanted to thank you for that excellent breakdown. It definitely is a challenge to not only learn this material, but also explain it. As Chloe highlighted at the beginning, we're working on recommendations. So a lot of the land use recommendations that you'll see here are simply based on the water and land use analysis specifically, and other, of course, other recommendations that you would, more likely see in a land use plan will be forthcoming. So just wanted to reiterate that. As you can see on the slide here, we're looking at some of the implications of our water and land use analysis for our land use, and specifically our land use maps and our land use plan, or plan maps. So land use, of course, is one of the mandated elements in every local government plan in South Carolina. And this may be the first time that we've linked the two, water and land use, and attempts to have recommendations that respond to not just the typical historic traditional land use plan, but also how water affects it. So with that being said, as you might expect, based on some of the elevation and elevation risk zones, you might expect that the first thing you see on this list here is reserving higher intensity land use categories for kind of our high ground zones. When you look at an elevation map, those high ground zones really pop out. So, we do want to see where we have opportunities for more intensity in those areas. Second, of course, we would assign in our lowest, sort of the lowest impact land use categories for areas, reserved for sort of conservation, kind of park areas. There's low-lying areas where you might expect to see, tidal flood risk, and marsh migration into the future. And then also between those high ground and those low ground sort of categories, areas, you could expect to see areas where we would accommodate all other types of intensities and densities in typical land use categories. And so, that's where you get in sort of the nitty gritty site specific planning and mitigation strategies. Next slide, please. So some of the most important recommendations that we pulled out here for this discussion are, of course, number one, let's make the best use of the highland throughout the city for residential, commercial, of course, all types of uses, especially those areas around current and future transit corridor. Our second item here would be reduce densities in the lower ground and eliminate perhaps development in future marsh migration areas. Of course, this would be longer term that we're talking about, but it's at this point in our discussion, our water and land use discussion, that we would start to see opportunities for introducing policies that would move in that direction of lowering or eliminating development in certain areas. So you would also adapt and defend structures currently in some of these areas where feasible. Number three, strategies for the middle ground sort of require additional study. Development in these areas will depend on analysis of drainage basins and stormwater easements. So we're talking about policy and code issues as opposed to specific land use categories in those cases. Number four, underscore responsibility of effective water management on higher ground and to better protect middle and lower ground downstream. This, of course, does get a little complex and is Chloe mentioned, this higher ground does have more of the responsibility in construction, especially if we're aiming to be able to grow in these areas with more development. Number 5, encourage use of green stormwater infrastructure, including clusters of trees, use of pervious surfaces, green roofs, and many other strategies. They get into more, much more detailed policies and incentives that we would like to see in the future.
Okay, the second level of second layer of recommendations relates to our natural resources element. So what we heard from the community relating to natural resources was to preserve valuable natural ecosystems and wildlife, not just to improve quality of life for residents, but also as a way to help mitigate flooding. People also wanted to see access to clean and healthy green space and water citywide, protecting the green belt around the city and enforcing the urban growth boundary, incorporating more natural solutions into future infrastructure projects versus structural. So as much as possible, the natural solutions like planting trees and vegetation, natural reefs, restoring old canals. That in any kind of improvements of these efforts to prioritize the most impacted older communities and historically disadvantaged communities. And in general, ensuring this is such this is an issue that people are confronting every day, and they're literally in their front yards and their homes, and so the communication and continuing engagement, transparency is very important, so people can understand what efforts are being undertaken, what's to come. And also to make sure that this engagement is happening to prevent any kind of displacement and help working with the community in any kind of mitigation measures to ensure that we're not causing more displacement. I'll let Jim read.
All right. Yeah. So I worked on the natural resources portion of the plan, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of overlap between land use and natural resources. So we wanted to share some recommendations that relate to both sections of the plan. So the first one is to implement recommendations of the trees to offset stormwater study, which was a study that the city undertook, I believe last year or maybe 2019, that has a lot of really specific recommendations related to our tree protection ordinance and some other tree specific recommendations. Let's see. Promote natural resource planning and zoning policies that align with the living with water approach from Dutch Dialogues. So we've talked kind of ad nauseum about that tonight, so I won't go too far into it. And plan and develop land use strategies that account for marsh migration, which is another thing we've talked a lot about. Sea level rise is forcing marshes to migrate, which means that our wetland buffers, the areas between the marsh and our waterways, are also changing. So we need to account for those buffers as marsh continues to grow. Next slide, please. And then number 4, support land conservation around the edges of the urban growth boundary. We've talked a little bit about the urban growth boundary tonight. Basically, it's a green, what we envision as a green strip around the city where it delineates strictly rural development on the outside of the urban growth boundary and more suburban development on the inside of it. So we want to make sure that we support conservation around the edges of the urban growth boundary to keep that stark contrast between rural and suburban. Number 5, let's see. Continue to expand our park system and then do it in an equitable way for underserved areas in our city, and also providing safe alternative connectivity, so public transit, bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure to make sure people can reach parks without necessarily having to sit in traffic. Number 6 is develop policies to amplify environmental justice considerations. And so Chloe alluded to this a moment ago from our community engagement. And we know that, you know, underserved communities in our city often bear the brunt of environmental policy, a lack of environmental resources planning. So we want to make sure we target those areas and make sure that we're doing it, our natural resources planning in a just way.
Before we wrap up this section here, just wanted to note that there were other things that came up through community input that will be addressed in other elements. One of those is addressing the root cause of sea level rise and climate change. A lot of this is going to be tackled through our climate action plan that is happening right now as well. We'll be bringing as much of those recommendations into the city plan as we can. Also, any kind of investments in renewable energy, the interconnected water plan, this was mentioned earlier, and then the regional collaboration. So how do we manage the multi-jurisdictional nature of the city and tackling a lot of these challenges. So these will all, you'll see the recommendations that respond to this input specifically in other elements of the plan. So make sure you're staying tuned to other opportunities to give feedback in future sessions and other activities.
All right, thank you, Chloe and Jim and Philip. So I just want to pause for a minute before we go into group discussion and just first explain what group discussion is like, what you'll be expected, you know, what you should be expecting, and then also just to make sure, I know that a lot of this was, it wasn't the most like exciting news. So, but it's still important. So if there's something that we shared, or not we, but the three of them shared that you want to clarify, like if you want us to go back to a slide and say, in a nutshell, what did you mean when you said that? We're happy to do that. So want to make sure that this doesn't come off as though, you know, we're just giving you information and we're throwing you in a group discussion. The second part that I will share on top of that is that when we get into the group discussion, we'll have about 20 minutes to talk. And during that time, you will have, each of you will be split up and then, or put into a group, as well as have about 4 team members that'll also be in that space. So between that breakout, you will have a lead facilitator and someone taking notes. The notes will not be attached to your name. It's just making sure that we transcribed it right and we heard your feedback. Additionally, once we come back to this space, we'd like you to choose one person in each of those spaces to share out. And it doesn't have to be a long drawn out thing, just your personal perspective of what you heard while you're in that space. So before we break into that, Deborah has a question. What would be an example of a higher ground location on the peninsula, or are we thinking outside of the peninsula?
Philip, you want to answer?
Yeah, I can, I guess, take a crack at that. So the question was, you know, where might we see high ground on the peninsula? So, you know, we do have some high ground, you know, as indicated by the maps, you know, elevation maps in each area of the city. On the peninsula specifically, we're looking at areas more or less along the King and Meeting Street kind of spine of the peninsula. That's historically, you know, where the highest ground has been. You know, as things developed, you know, decades and centuries ago, those streets were the high areas of the city where you might have seen the most intense development. And that seems to be, you know, what we'll be doing now is kind of targeting those areas to receive, you know, more growth, maybe a little more mix of uses and a little more intensity on the peninsula. Other parts of the peninsula do you know, do drop off as you sort of head, you know, towards the rivers and the harbor. But again, as Chloe pointed out in the presentation, we are looking at solutions on the peninsula that are a little different than the rest of the city as far as land use and planning strategies around flooding and water.
Thank you, Philip. We have another question as well, and that is from Susan. So, well, actually, I'm sorry, Margaret actually sent a question. She said, I understand that Dominion is trying to discourage solar panels. How do you address that opposition?
I might answer that. I think that's, you know, a comprehensive plan by its very nature has to be a kind of a 30,000 foot document. And it's probably not going to get into that kind of a level of detail in, you know, our regulations and things we might encourage. I think we would definitely be saying we'd love to see more solar used in the city, but the exact regulations that Dominion is using and how we would combat those, that's a little bit more detailed than a comprehensive plan would cover.
Thank you, Christopher. What is the first deadline for this plan? Final, excuse me.
Yeah,
Final,
I answered this in the chat, but I can just repeat it real quickly. So we expect to present a final draft to Planning Commission and then City Council in May. But at that point, they can discuss and ask for more revisions and discuss and ask. That process can take weeks or months. That's up to City Council and Planning Commission. But so that timeline, that long-term timeline is uncertain, but we ultimately are required to have adopted a new plan by the end of this year. Christopher, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and you know, council has a lot of things to be doing this year, so we really want to get this thing wrapped up. The goal is to really have it through Planning Commission in May and at least present it to council at some point in May. If they want to take a little bit more time to discuss it, then that might go on a little bit beyond May, but that is our intent and we will deliver it then.
Thank you. Another question is, will the BAR allow solar panels on the downtown roofs? Do y'all know that?
And again, it's a little bit more of a detailed question. I know
Sure.
that they are looking at the issue. I think there are going to be instances where it is allowed. I think there are going to be instances where it isn't. I think it's going to have to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards to help us maintain our National Register status in Charleston.
Okay.
If I could just make a quick note, some of these questions that are coming up to just illustrate the role of the city plan. When we make these recommendations, these more broad general recommendations, if they're adopted in the city plan, that provides a foundation so that future policies can be introduced, brought to City Council saying, this is how we want to implement this recommendation. So those policies that are introduced after the city plan is adopted, that's where we get into the specifics and some of the questions that you have. So the recommendations are important to have that foundation in place, but the specifics come afterward. And that's why you see us sort of backing away from some of these more specific questions, not because it's not necessary to get into the specifics, but that's not the role of the city plan.
I just had
Lonnie has her hand raised.
Okay.
Yeah,
well,
I
wait,
had a general question about the process that we're
actually, Lonnie, just 1 second. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt
Sure.
you. We do have one question that came in privately to me, so I just wanted to share that one just before Lonnie answers hers. The Peninsula got an asterisk with a reference to special considerations. What in brief are the recommendations or approach?
And I think Philip kind of talked about that, and that is that we're going to make the assumption that because of the planning that's going on for barrier protection, that at some point in the life of this plan, we will be on a definite course going forward with barrier protection. And so the Peninsula is going to have that assumption with some of its land use recommendations.
Okay. Thank you, Christopher. Appreciate that. Okay. Sorry, Lanny.
That's okay. So my question was a bit more pointed towards the process that we're in now. And I'm one of the people that was involved in the kind of data collection and focus groups in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
So with regards to this process, Are we still in the needs assessment where you're collecting input from us as citizens? Are you trying to refine the prioritization? Are you looking for us to kind of test the messaging so that when it goes out to the broader public, you've anticipated and refined some of the content for understandability? Just kind of where are we at in the plan itself?
Sure.
So yeah, what we've got are the kind of bones of the plan right now and some of the key findings. And so we're sharing those in a public format over the next 5 weeks so that we can get input on those and share that input with Planning Commission and Council when we send the full document of the plan to them in May.
Yeah, so we expect from these next few weeks, we're asking for your feedback. So, you know, these are the recommendations that this is the first time we presented them to the public, where we haven't even finished the draft plan, but we've pulled out the critical pieces that we want the community's feedback on, the recommendations being a core part of that, and then the land use maps. And we want the community's feedback, say, you know, what do you think? What's missing? Do you support these recommendations? Or do you have concerns with these recommendations? And then we can make tweaks to the plan, make revisions to the plan based on that feedback, and then take a final draft to Planning Commission and City Council.
All right. So what we will do now is take about 10 minutes. We'll break out in our group session. Not even 10. Oh yeah, we have about 10. So we will break out really quickly and go into smaller group discussion. And this is honestly a time when you can just express your thought. This is not recorded. This is just, you know, us just talking in a smaller group. If you want to express your thoughts, anything of that nature, this is the time to do it. As I said, you'll have city team represented as well as the engagements from the consulting side, from the process overall. And then you will definitely have yourselves too, which are individuals who live within the community and have those experiences to share. So we'll go ahead and break out and we'll be back in 10 minutes.